The whistle of the locomotive is a mournful cry, tearing through the thin, dry air of Redemption Creek. It is the sound of departure, of finality. For Eliza May Thompson, it is the sound of her world shrinking to the size of a dusty train platform, a single worn carpetbag at her feet, and the scornful face of the man she had traveled 1,000 miles to marry. Jedediah Croft, a man whose correspondence had been clipped and practical, is even more so in the flesh. His face is a roadmap of hard sun and harder opinions. His gaze falls from her face, weary from the journey, to the object in her hands, a dog-eared novel, its cover depicting a windswept heroine on a stormy cliffside. His lip curls. "A book," he says, the word in accusation. "The agent said you were sturdy, said you were practical. He did not mention you were a dreamer." Eliza's hands tighten on the book, her only companion for the long, rattling journey. "I enjoy reading, Mr. Croft. It passes the time. It is no measure of my ability to work. It's a measure of a mind filled with nonsense," he counters, his voice loud enough for the few lingering townsfolk to turn and stare. "I need a wife, not a poet. A woman who understands yield and acreage, not flowery words and impossible romances. A woman whose hands are for churning butter, not turning pages." He gestures dismissively at her. "You are not what I ordered. I cannot use a woman with her head in the clouds. I rescind my offer." The words hang in the air, each one a stone cast at her. Rescind. Ordered. Use. She feels the heat of shame creep up her neck, a blush more painful than any sunburn. The stationmaster averts his gaze. A woman in a severe bonnet whispers to her companion, who sniffs with clear disapproval. Stranded. The next train heading east isn't for 3 days, and her purse contains little more than lint and a few lonely pennies. The life she had hoped for, a simple arrangement of mutual need, has evaporated before it even began. And with 3 words, "I rescind my offer," her hope and her future were irrevocably shattered. There's more to this character than meets the eye. Before their true worth or secret comes to light, tell us, have you ever misjudged someone only to be surprised? And if you love a story of hidden depths, hit like and subscribe. She is a statue of despair on a platform of judgment. Jedediah Croft turns on his heel without another word, already moving toward a stouter, plainer woman who had been waiting near the freight office, likely his second, more practical choice. The locomotive gives a final, shuddering hiss and begins to chug away, pulling the last of Eliza's old life with it into the shimmering heat of the horizon. It was in this moment of absolute stillness, when the dust settled and the silence of her predicament became a roar in her ears, that a new sound emerged. The soft scuff of boots on the wooden planks. A man had stepped out of the shadows of the station house, a figure she hadn't noticed before. He was tall, dressed in dark, simple clothes that had seen better days, and his face was obscured by the brim of a low-pulled hat. He stopped a few feet from her, his presence a quiet interruption to her public humiliation. "He is a fool," the man said. His voice was low and gravelly, and used to public pronouncements. It wasn't offered as comfort, but as a statement of fact, as one might observe that the sky was blue or the ground was dry. Eliza flinched, expecting more scorn. She looked up, and for the first time, saw his face clearly as he tipped his hat back a fraction. He was not old, perhaps 35, but his eyes held the deep, weary caution of a man much older. A neatly trimmed beard and mustache framed a mouth set in a firm, unsmiling line. He looked like a man who kept his own counsel and expected the world to leave him to it. He was Silas Croft, Jedediah's cousin, a name she only knew as a footnote in one of the letters. The town recluse, the odd one who lived in the old house at the edge of the woods. "A fool he may be," Eliza replied, her voice trembling but clear, "but he held my future in his hands, a future that is now adrift." Silas's gaze swept over her, taking in the neat but worn dress, the desperate clutch on her book, the proud set of her chin despite the tears threatening her eyes. He was a man who understood being an outcast. He saw not a frivolous dreamer, but a fellow creature cornered by the world's harsh practicality. He had come to town for flour and salt, a rare and grudging errand, and had witnessed the entire brutal exchange. Something in Jedediah's casual cruelty had ignited a spark of cold fury in Silas's quiet heart. He thought of his own home, a place of silence, dust, and towering stacks of books. It was a sanctuary for him, but it was also a tomb of routine and loneliness. It was disordered. It was neglected. An idea, impractical and sudden, took root. "I have need of a housekeeper," he said, the words as stark and unadorned as his appearance. Eliza blinked, confused. "A housekeeper? My home is in disarray," he continued, his tone flat, transactional. "I require someone to manage the cooking and cleaning. I can offer room, board, and a small wage. It is not the life of a wife, but it is a roof and a purpose. It is an alternative to adrift." The offer was as unexpected as the rejection had been. She looked from the departing wagon, carrying the smug Jedediah, to this quiet, somber man. His eyes were unreadable, offering no false pity, no hint of untoward intention. They offered only a solution, as plain and solid as a wooden beam. The town of Redemption Creek had already judged her. What more did she have to lose? Clutching her novel like a shield, Eliza gave a single, decisive nod. "I accept, Mr. Croft." "Silas," he corrected softly. He bent down, surprising her, and took her heavy carpet bag in one hand. His fingers brushed against hers, and she felt the callous skin of a man who worked, but not in the fields. It was the roughness of a writer's cramp, the grip of a man who held a pen, not a plow. As he led her away from the platform and toward the dusty track that led out of town, the whispering behind them faded. They walked in silence, two solitary figures moving away from the heart of the community and toward the quiet fringes where the forgotten and the misunderstood resided. The house, when it came into view, was just as she might have imagined. A two-story clapboard structure, once grand, now surrendering to time and neglect. Paint peeled like sunburnt skin, and the garden was a riot of weeds and wildflowers. Yet, it stood with a kind of dignified solitude, nestled amongst the tall pines that marked the edge of civilization. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of old paper, leather, and dust. But it was the sheer volume of books that stole Eliza's breath. They were not confined to a single shelf or room. They were everywhere, stacked on the floor, overflowing from crates, lining the mantelpiece, climbing the stairs. It was not a house with a library. It was a library that grudgingly served as a house. Silas seemed to notice her astonishment. A flicker of something, perhaps embarrassment, perhaps pride, crossed his face. "As I said," he mumbled, gesturing vaguely at the literary chaos, "it is in disarray." He showed her to a small, spare room upstairs. It was clean, though stark, with a simple iron bedstead, a wash basin, and a window that looked out not toward the town, but into the deep, quiet green of the forest. It felt like a haven. "The duties are simple," Silas instructed, his voice retaining its formal, distant edge. He stood in the doorway, a sentinel guarding his own solitude. 3 meals a day. Keep the main living areas navigable. The rest of the house, especially my study, is my own concern. Your time, otherwise, is your own." He paused, his gaze falling once more to the book she still held. "There is one other rule." Eliza braced herself. "You may read any book in this house," he said, his voice softening almost imperceptibly. "Any of them. Consider it part of your wages." And with that, he turned and descended the stairs, the sound of his footsteps swallowed by the vast, silent collection of stories that filled his home. Eliza sank onto the bed, the springs groaning in protest. She looked around the small, plain room, then out the window at the whispering pines. She had been publicly shamed, rejected, and left with nothing. Yet, in the strangest turn of events, she had fallen from the frying pan of Jedediah Croft's rigid world into a dusty, forgotten library with a man made of secrets and shadows. She had been ridiculed for her love of stories, only to find herself living in a house built of them. The first few days passed in a haze of awkward silence and discovery. Eliza moved through the house like a ghost, learning its creaks and groans, its pockets of dust, and its streams of sunlight. She was a meticulous worker, driven by a deep, abiding gratitude that felt heavier than any stone. She scrubbed floors until the wood gleamed, polished windows until the forest outside seemed to be in the room with them, and coaxed the old iron stove into producing simple, savory meals. The scent of baking bread and simmering stew began to replace the stale smell of dust, a quiet culinary rebellion against the house's neglect. Silas remained a creature of habit and distance. He would emerge from his study, a room she was forbidden to enter. For meals, his fingers often smudged with ink. He would eat quickly, his eyes fixed on his plate, offering clipped, monosyllabic answers to her tentative questions about the weather or household needs. He was not unkind, merely absent. His body was at the table, but his mind was clearly elsewhere, wrestling with words and worlds she couldn't see. Yet, it was in the evenings that the house truly transformed. After the supper dishes were washed and put away, a silent understanding developed. Eliza would choose a book from a teetering stack in the parlor, settle into a worn armchair by the fire, and lose herself in its pages. Silas, from the opposite side of the hearth, would do the same. The only sounds would be the crackle of the fire, the whisper of a turning page, and the ticking of the grand clock in the hall. In these shared silences, Eliza began to study him. She saw the way his brow would furrow in concentration, the ghost of a smile that would touch his lips when he read something that pleased him. She noticed the way he cared for his books, handling them with a reverence that bordered on devotion. He was a fortress, but she was beginning to see the shape of the man inside the walls. Her curiosity was most piqued by one author in particular, Augustus Crane. His novels were the pinnacle of the genre she so loved. Tales of adventure on the high seas, of honor-bound heroes in faraway lands, of love that conquered impossible odds. Silas owned every one of his works, many of them pristine first editions. It was a novel by Crane she had been clutching at the train station, and it was to his world she retreated each night. One evening, while reading The Corsair's Vow, she let out a small, involuntary sigh of satisfaction as the hero cleverly outwitted his rival. From across the hearth, Silas looked up. "A satisfying resolution?" he asked, his voice startling her out of her literary stupor. "Oh, yes," she breathed, her face animated. "Captain Thorne is so brilliantly conceived. He is honorable, but not foolishly so. He is clever, but his plans are not so perfect that you don't fear for him." Augustus Crane writes men of action who also possess a deep inner life. It is a rare talent. Silas watched her, his expression unreadable in the flickering firelight. "You find his work compelling." "More than compelling," she said, her usual timidity forgotten in her passion. "His stories, they feel true, even in their fantasy. They suggest that, even in the harshest of worlds, there is room for decency and courage. That a person's worth isn't measured by their station, but by their character." She looked down at the book, a blush rising on her cheeks as she realized she was speaking from the heart. "They have been a great comfort to me." A log shifted in the fire, sending a shower of sparks up the chimney. For a long moment, Silas said nothing. He simply watched her, his dark eyes holding an intensity that made her feel seen in a way she never had before. "It is good the books bring you comfort, Eliza," he said at last, his voice softer than she had ever heard it. He then stood, bid her a quiet good night, and retreated to his study, leaving her alone with the fire and the lingering echo of his words. A week later, a trip to town was unavoidable. The flour sack was empty, and they were low on coffee. Silas seemed to dread the excursion, his shoulders tightening as they hitched the quiet old mare to the buckboard. For Eliza, it was a trial. The memory of the train station was a fresh wound, and she feared the whispers and stares. Her fears were well-founded. As they walked toward the mercantile, she saw Mrs. Gable, the woman in the severe bonnet, standing with two other townswomen. Their conversation stopped. Their eyes raked over Eliza, noting her simple but clean dress, and then shifted to Silas, their expressions a mixture of suspicion and pity. "Well, look at that," Mrs. Gable said, her voice a stage whisper designed to carry. "The recluse has himself a little charity case. I wonder what sort of housekeeping she's doing for him." The accompanying snickers were like tiny, sharp pebbles thrown at Eliza. She flinched, her gaze dropping to the dusty street. She felt Silas stiffen beside her. He stopped walking and turned to face the women, his shadow falling over them. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. The cold stillness in his eyes was more effective than any shout. "Mrs. Gable," he said, his voice level and dangerously calm, "I find my household arrangements and Miss Thompson's character to be subjects far too refined for your particular brand of public speculation. I trust one will not have to correct your assumptions again." The women were stunned into silence, their mouths agape. No one in Redemption Creek spoke to Mrs. Gable that way. Silas Croft, the man who barely spoke at all, had just dressed her down in the middle of the street. Without another glance, he placed a light but firm hand on the small of Eliza's back, a gesture of both guidance and protection, and steered her into the mercantile. Inside, the air was thick with unspoken questions. Mr. Henderson, the proprietor, busied himself weighing out flour, his eyes darting between them. As Silas paid, a figure blocked the doorway. It was Jedediah, his new fiancée, a sturdy, silent woman named Martha at his side. Jedediah's eyes narrowed as he took in the scene. He saw Silas, his quiet cousin, standing beside the woman he had cast off. He saw the faint blush on Eliza's cheeks and the protective posture Silas had unconsciously adopted. A sour, unfamiliar feeling, something akin to jealousy, curdled in his gut. "Well, cousin," Jedediah drawled, a smirk playing on his lips, "I see you picked up my leavings. I hope she's earning her keep. She seems better suited to dusting your books than birthing sons." Before Eliza could shrink away, before the shame could reclaim her, Silas stepped forward slightly, positioning himself between her and his cousin. "What I do with my charity is my own affair," Silas said, his voice deceptively mild. "But you, Jedediah, seem to have confused charity with opportunity. I took in a person in need. You cast one aside out of foolish pride and a lack of imagination. I dare say my investment will prove the wiser." He met his cousin's glare without flinching. The tension in the small store was palpable. Jedediah, for all his bluster, seemed to recognize a line had been drawn. He grunted, pulling Martha past them with a rough tug on her arm, and stalked toward the counter. As they walked back to the buckboard, the sack of flour a heavy weight between them, the silence felt different. It was no longer awkward or empty. It was charged, filled with the unspoken events of the last 10 minutes. Silas had defended her. Twice. He had stood as a shield between her and the town's, and his own cousin's, cruelty. Back at the house, as she put the supplies away in the pantry, Eliza felt a warmth spreading through her that had nothing to do with the afternoon sun. It was gratitude, yes, but it was something more. It was a burgeoning respect, a fragile admiration for the quiet, solitary man who wielded silence like a weapon and words like a shield. Later that evening, as she was tidying the parlor, she noticed the door to his study was ajar. A sliver of golden lamplight spilled out into the hall. She knew she shouldn't, but a force she couldn't name pulled her forward. Peeking through the crack, she saw him not at his desk, but standing by the window, looking out into the darkness. His shoulders were slumped, the weight of the day's confrontation seeming to settle upon him. He looked in that moment profoundly lonely. Her heart ached for him. This man who had given her sanctuary was himself a prisoner of his own making. He had protected her from the town, but who protected him from his own solitude? Without thinking, she went to the kitchen, poured a cup of the fresh coffee she'd bought, and carried it to his study door. She knocked softly. He started, turning from the window. "Eliza, I thought you might want some coffee, Silas," she said, her voice barely a whisper. He hesitated, then opened the door wider. "Thank you." He took the cup, his fingers brushing hers again. This time, the contact lingered for a heartbeat longer than necessary. His gaze met hers, and in the depths of his tired eyes, she saw not a recluse, but a man starved for a simple act of kindness. "Eliza," he began, his voice rough with an emotion she couldn't place. "About what happened in town today." "You don't have to say anything," she interrupted softly. "You were very gallant, like one of Captain Thorne's men." The corner of his mouth twitched, the ghost of a smile she had seen before. "I assure you, I am no one's gallant man." "I disagree," she said, her boldness surprising them both. She glanced past him into the study, her eyes falling on a sheaf of papers on his desk. They were covered in a dense, elegant script. "You build worlds with words, Silas. You defend the defenseless. If that is not gallantry, I don't know what is." She retreated then, leaving him in the doorway of his sanctuary, the cup of coffee warming his hands. Silas watched her go, a profound and unsettling shift occurring within him. She saw him not as the town did, as an oddity, a recluse, but as something more, something better. He had hired a housekeeper to bring order to his home, but Eliza Thompson was slowly, quietly, bringing order to his life. And the fortress he had built around his heart was beginning to feel less like a sanctuary and more like a cage. The most terrifying part was that she, with her quiet grace and her love for stories, was the only one who held the key. The weeks bled into a month, and the rhythm of their life settled into a comfortable cadence. The house on the edge of the woods became less a place of employment and more a shared space of quiet coexistence. Eliza's touch was everywhere. In the polished wood of the banister, the neatly organized pantry, the pot of wildflowers she'd placed on the kitchen table. She had tamed the chaos of the house, and in doing so, had carved out a space for herself within its walls that felt undeniably like home. Their evenings by the fire became the anchor of their days. Their conversations, once stilted and brief, now flowed with an easy grace. They spoke of the worlds they visited in their books, debating the merits of a character's choice or the beauty of a descriptive passage. Through these discussions, Eliza began to piece together a portrait of the man behind the reclusive exterior. Silas possessed a mind that was sharp, analytical, and deeply empathetic. He saw the nuances in stories and in people, which explained both the brilliance she admired in Augustus Crane's writing and the pain he must have felt from the town's shallow judgments. For Silas, these conversations were a revelation. Eliza was not merely a passive consumer of stories. She was an active, intelligent participant. She understood theme and subtext. She felt the emotional core of a narrative, and her insights were often so astute they left him breathless. He found himself unconsciously seeking her opinion, valuing her perspective more than any editor or critic he had ever known. He began leaving the door to his study open, a silent invitation. One afternoon, she found the courage to ask him about it. "Silas," she began, her hands twisting in her apron as she stood at the threshold. "I know you're a private man, but what is it you write in here all day?" He looked up from his desk, a pen poised over a freshly inked page. He considered her for a long moment, his gaze searching her face. The old Silas, the man who had hired her at the train station, would have shut the question down. But that man was slowly being eroded, replaced by someone who craved connection. "I am attempting a novel," he admitted, the words feeling strange on his tongue. Her eyes lit up. "Truly? What is it about?" He hesitated, then gestured to the chair opposite his desk. "It's a story about a lighthouse keeper," he said, as she sat down tentatively. "A man who chooses isolation to escape a past grief, but finds his solitary world interrupted by a woman who is shipwrecked on his shore." Eliza listened, captivated. "And she changes him. She reminds him," Silas corrected softly, "that a light is not meant to be hidden. It's meant to guide others home." The air in the room grew thick with the unspoken parallels. They sat in a comfortable silence, the story hanging between them, a fragile bridge connecting his world to hers. From that day on, he would sometimes read her a passage he was struggling with, and she would offer a gentle suggestion or a word of encouragement. She had become his first reader, his muse. He was writing the story of a lighthouse keeper, but he was also, in a way, writing the story of them. This fragile piece, however, was not destined to last. Redemption Creek had a long memory and a sharp tongue. The story of the recluse and his charity case had become a favorite topic of gossip at the church, sewing circle, and over-the-counter at the mercantile. Their unconventional arrangement was an affront to the town's rigid sense of propriety. The pressure began to mount. The preacher, Reverend Miller, made a pastoral call one afternoon. He was a stern man with eyes that seemed to be constantly searching for sin. He spoke to Silas in the parlor while Eliza strained to hear from the kitchen. The Reverend's voice was low and pious, full of words like impropriety, temptation, and concern for the young woman's soul. Silas's replies were clipped and cold. "Miss Thompson is my employee. Her soul and my own are our private concerns." The visit ended with a thinly veiled threat from the Reverend. "The community has a duty to protect the vulnerable, Mr. Croft. If this situation is not regularized, the town council may feel compelled to take action." The words hung in the air long after the preacher had gone. Regularized. It could only mean one thing: marriage or Eliza's removal. The idea of her being sent away, back to the mercy of a world that had already cast her out, sent a shard of ice through Silas's heart. He looked at her as she served supper that night, her face etched with worry, and he realized the depth of his feelings. This was no longer about charity or responsibility. He could not bear the thought of this house, this life without her in it. The silence she had filled would be deafening. The final blow came a few days later, delivered once again by Jedediah. He rode up to the house, his face a mask of smug righteousness. "The council met last night, cousin," he announced from his horse, not bothering to dismount. "On the preacher's urging, they've decided Miss Thompson cannot remain here under your protection. It sets a poor moral example. They've arranged for her to be sent to the women's workhouse in Centerville. They say it's a more suitable place for a woman of her uncertain position," he smirked. "The coach comes Friday." Friday. It was Tuesday. The world seemed to tilt on its axis. Eliza, who had come to the door behind Silas, let out a small, strangled gasp. The workhouse. It was a prison for the poor and the forgotten, a place of grueling labor and hopeless despair. Everything she had worked to build, the fragile sense of safety and belonging she had found, was about to be ripped away by the cruel hypocrisy of the town. Silas's hands clenched into fists at his sides. He stared at his cousin, a cold, dangerous rage building within him. This was not about morality. This was about power. It was Jedediah's petty revenge, sanctified by the town's prejudice. "Get off my land, Jedediah," Silas said, his voice a low growl. "Just delivering the news," Jedediah sneered, turning his horse. "It's for her own good, after all." As he rode away, Silas turned to Eliza. Her face was ashen, her eyes wide with a terror that mirrored the one he'd seen at the train station. But this time it was infinitely worse because now she had something precious to lose. They both did. He led her back inside, to the parlor, and sat her down in the armchair by the cold hearth. He knelt before her, taking her trembling hands in his. "I will not let them do this," he said, his voice fierce with a conviction that startled them both. "I will not let them take you." "But how?" she whispered, her voice breaking. "They're the town council. They have the law on their side. Then we will make our own law," he said. He looked around the room, at the books that had been their refuge, their common ground. His gaze landed on the shelf that held the complete works of Augustus Crane. An idea, wild and terrifying and absolutely necessary, began to form in his mind. It was the only move he had left to play. It was the ultimate reveal, the final chapter he had never intended to write. "Eliza," he said, his voice suddenly quiet and grave. "There is something I must tell you. Something I should have told you long ago." He stood and walked not to the front door to bar it, but to his study. He returned a moment later carrying two things: a leather-bound copy of The Corsair's Vow and a sheaf of papers tied with a simple ribbon. It was the manuscript for his lighthouse keeper story. He handed her the manuscript first. "You know this story," he said. "You helped me find its heart." She took it, her fingers tracing the title he had written on the cover page. The last light beneath it, where the author's name should be, was a blank space. Then he opened the published novel, The Corsair's Vow, to its title page. She saw the familiar, soaring name in elegant print, Augustus Crane. Silas took a deep breath, the air shuddering in his chest. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a folded, official-looking letter. It was from a publisher in Boston. He unfolded it and laid it on the table beside the book. The letter was addressed to Mr. Silas Croft, and it discussed royalty payments for the sales of The Corsair's Vow. Eliza's eyes darted from the letter to the book, then to the manuscript in her hands, and finally to the face of the man standing before her. Her mind raced, connecting the impossible dots. His vast library, his love for Crane's work, his sharp insights, his writer's hands, the story of the lonely man rescued by a woman from the sea. The truth was so immense, so staggering, it defied belief. "You?" she whispered, her voice filled with awe and disbelief. "You are him?" Silas nodded, his face pale, his eyes searching hers for a reaction. Condemnation, disappointment, anything. "My full name is Silas Augustus Croft," he said softly. "Crane is a family name. My mother's. I adopted it as a pen name when I came here. I wanted anonymity." Eliza was speechless. The man who had saved her from destitution, the quiet, reclusive figure the town mocked, was the very architect of the worlds that had saved her soul 1,000 times over. The hero she had admired on the page was the same man who had defended her in the mercantile, who had offered her coffee and kindness, whose loneliness mirrored her own. Tears welled in her eyes, but they were not tears of fear or sadness. They were tears of profound, earth-shattering recognition. She looked at him, truly looked at him, and saw the honorable heart of Captain Thorne, the deep empathy of the lighthouse keeper, and the quiet courage of Silas Croft, all residing in one man. All this time, she breathed, a slow, wondrous smile spreading across her face. "I was living in his house." The fear in Silas's eyes finally gave way to a wave of overwhelming relief. She understood. She was not disappointed. She saw him. "Eliza," he said, his voice thick with emotion as he took her hands again. "The town wants to regularize our situation. They have given us a deadline. They want to send you away to protect your reputation." He paused, his grip tightening on her hands. "I'm asking you to let me protect it instead. Not as your employer, but as your husband. Marry me, Eliza. Not for propriety, not for the town, but for us. Let this house of stories be the start of our own." The choice was no choice at all. It was an inevitability, a chapter that had been written in the stars long before she ever stepped onto the train. She was the shipwrecked woman, and he was her lighthouse. "Yes," she whispered, the single word sealing their fate. "Yes, Silas. Yes." The morning of the confrontation dawned clear and bright, a stark contrast to the storm brewing in the heart of Redemption Creek. Friday. The coach to the Centerville workhouse was due at noon. By mid-morning, a small, grim procession was making its way up the dusty track to Silas's house. At its head was Reverend Miller, his Bible clutched like a weapon. Flanking him was Jedediah Croft, a look of vindictive triumph on his face, and 2 other members of the town council, men with hard faces and harder hearts. They were not coming for a discussion. They were coming to execute a sentence. Silas watched them approach from the parlor window. For a moment, the old instinct to retreat, to barricade the door and hide within his fortress of books, washed over him. But then he felt a gentle touch on his arm. It was Eliza. She stood beside him, no longer the timid woman from the train platform. Her eyes were clear and steady, her chin held high. She wore her best dress, a simple navy calico she had mended herself, and she looked not like a victim, but like a queen surveying her domain. "We face them together," she said, her voice a quiet anchor in the turbulent moment. He nodded, drawing strength from her resolve. He had spent a lifetime creating heroes on paper. It was time to be one. When a knock came, loud and imperious, Silas opened the door wide. He did not block the threshold, but stepped back, allowing the men to see not only him, but Eliza standing just behind him, a united front. "Mr. Croft," the Reverend began, his tone oozing sanctimonious authority. We are here, as discussed, to escort Miss Thompson to a place of greater moral security. There is no place more secure for her than here, Silas replied, his voice calm and even. Jedediah scoffed. The council has decided, cousin. Your arrangement is over. She's a ward of the community now. He looked past Silas to Eliza, his gaze dismissive. Pack your things, girl. The coach won't wait. It was then that Eliza stepped forward, moving to stand shoulder to shoulder with Silas. The move was so unexpected it momentarily silenced the man. I will not be packing my things, Mr. Croft, she said, her voice ringing with newfound confidence. She addressed Jedediah, but her words were for all of them. You speak of morality, but you humiliated me for the crime of loving books. You speak of security, but you would send me to a place of despair. You call me a ward, as if I am a child or an imbecile, incapable of making my own choices. She took a breath, her gaze sweeping over the council members. The man you see as a recluse gave me shelter when I had none. The man you scorn as an oddity showed me kindness when you showed me only contempt. In this house, I have found more decency and honor than exists in all of your council meetings combined. My place is here. Reverend Miller, recovering from the shock of her defiance, puffed out his chest. This is improper. A young, unmarried woman living in the home of a bachelor. It is an outrage against common decency. The law is clear. Indeed, it is, Silas said, stepping forward. He took Eliza's hand in his, their fingers lacing together in a gesture of unshakable solidarity. Which is why Miss Thompson and I will be heading to the county seat this afternoon to be married by the justice of the peace. A collective gasp went through the small delegation. Jedediah's jaw dropped, his triumphant smirk vanishing. Married? You can't be serious. To her? A penniless dreamer who fills her head with nonsense. Silas's eyes hardened. This was the moment. The final, decisive move. You speak of her reading as a flaw, Jedediah, Silas said, his voice rising, carrying across the porch and into the still morning air. You, in this town, have ridiculed her for her love of stories. You praise practicality and scorn imagination. But I wonder how many of you, his gaze swept over them all, have a novel by Augustus Crane on your parlor shelf? He saw a flicker of recognition, of confusion in their eyes. The name was famous, a source of pride for any who valued thrilling, moralistic tales. I imagine, Silas continued, pressing his advantage, you admire his heroes, his brave sea captains, his noble adventurers. You read his words about honor, courage, and the true measure of a person's worth. He paused, letting the silence stretch. Then he delivered the final, devastating blow. My name, he announced, his voice clear and resonant, is Silas Augustus Croft. The man who writes those books stands before you now. And the woman you have mocked, the dreamer you cast aside, is the finest and most perceptive reader I have ever known. She is my muse, my partner, and she is soon to be my wife. You came here to pass judgment on her, but in doing so, you have revealed only your own shallow, hypocritical souls. You have scorned the very imagination that you consume in private. Now, I believe you have the address for the county seat. You may send your congratulations there. The silence that followed was absolute, profound, and shattering. The councilmen stared, their faces a comical mixture of disbelief and dawning horror. They had been publicly praising the work of the very man they were privately persecuting. Jedediah looked as if he'd been struck by lightning, his face pale with humiliation. He had not just rejected a mail-order bride. He had rejected the muse of the most celebrated author of their time. He had called genius useless. Reverend Miller opened and closed his mouth like a fish, no pious words forthcoming. Their moral authority had been stripped away, exposed as nothing more than ignorant prejudice. Without another word, they turned, a defeated posse, and retreated down the path, their righteous mission in tatters. Jedediah was the last to leave, unable to meet Silas's steady gaze. The door closed, shutting out the world. The house was suddenly, blessedly quiet. Silas and Eliza stood in the entryway, the adrenaline of the confrontation slowly receding, leaving behind something pure and solid. He turned to her, his heart full. He saw in her eyes not just love, but a fierce, brilliant pride. "My muse," he said softly, a true, unreserved smile finally reaching his eyes. "My author," she replied, her voice brimming with happy tears. She reached up and touched his face, her fingers tracing the line of his jaw. "I believe you have a wedding to arrange, Mr. Croft." He leaned down and kissed her then. It was not a kiss of frantic passion, but of deep, resonant homecoming. It was a kiss that tasted of old paper, fresh ink, and a future filled with shared stories. In the quiet, dusty house on the edge of town, surrounded by the world he had created, Silas Croft had finally found his own best story. And it was just beginning. The afternoon sun slants through the newly cleaned windows of the parlor, illuminating the dancing dust motes in golden shafts of light. A quiet peace has settled over the house, a stillness born not of solitude, but of contentment. The confrontation is over. The town's judgment, once a looming thunderhead, has been reduced to a distant, grumbling cloud that no longer holds any power over them. In the kitchen, Eliza hums a soft, tuneless melody as she kneads dough for their evening bread. Her hands, once ridiculed for their preference for pages, move with a confident, practiced rhythm. There's a newfound lightness in her posture, an easy grace in her movements. She is no longer a guest, nor an employee, nor a charity case. She is the lady of this house, the heart of this home. Silas sits at his desk in the study, the door wide open. The page before him is blank, but his mind is full. He is not thinking of sea captains or lighthouse keepers. He is watching his wife-to-be, listening to the quiet, domestic music she creates. He thinks of the journey that brought them here, the brutal rejection at the station, the awkward silences, the shared evenings by the fire, the slow, cautious unfurling of two lonely souls. He had offered her a roof over her head out of fleeting sense of justice, a rebellion against his cousin's cruelty. He never imagined he was truly offering her a key to the prison of his own making. She had not just brought order to his home, she had brought light to his life. She catches him watching and smiles, a genuine, radiant smile that makes the room brighter. "The story isn't writing itself, Mr. Crane," she teases gently. "No," he agrees, his voice soft with an emotion that still feels new and overwhelming. "I believe it is living itself." He stands and walks to her, drawn by an invisible thread. He rests his hands on her shoulders, breathing in the warm, comforting scent of flower and fresh hope. He looks at their reflection in the small window over the sink. A man who had hidden from the world and a woman the world had tried to throw away, now standing together as one. He had been a celebrated author, a creator of fictions, but his greatest, truest work was this. The life they were building together, a narrative founded on kindness, sealed by courage, and filled with a love more profound than any he could ever write. Thanks for watching. If you believe in compassion, overcoming prejudice, and finding love in unexpected places, give this story a like and subscribe for more. Her true worth was finally seen. What does true value in a person mean to you? Tell us below.